Yesterday, after getting up and just laying around, to be completely honest, I heard something that caught my attention in a podcast, and I thought it was very interesting, so I kind of wanted to talk about it. But this podcast was it was a populist versus 20 Democrats and Republicans from Jubilee. And it was so interesting because they took the guy from the Young Turks. I don't even know his name, if I'm being completely honest. I do know the channel, it's on YouTube, pretty successful channel. And the argument was pretty much that we need politicians that are not bought and paid for. But at the same time, it has to be someone that can get enough attention to actually get votes from the voters, get a lot of support behind him because, he's going to need help. You can't make enemies with everyone in the world. You got to have some friends, right, to get certain things done. And not only that, but also be willing not to take money from corporations and other government entities or even bribes or, donations because it doesn't align with their interests or their viewpoint or their, political viewpoint. So now what kind of person would be able to actually do this? I mean, first of all, man, it would take a tremendously special person. That's number one. It would be crazy that this person would even get enough airtime or you would even know who they are. You ever notice that in presidential elections, you have that one independent guy, or maybe there's a Democrat or a Republican on there that you never heard of, and they end up with, 1% of the vote, whatever it is. It would have to take someone like that, someone you don't even know very well. And those people are even taking donations, so you got to sit back and think, what kind of person would this be? He would have to be crazy enough to say no to money in all ways possible. Running a campaign is very expensive. Think about all the travel that they have to do. Think about going door to door, the commercials, everything. Guys, it's expensive. It's very expensive. You know, Not only that, he would have to make friends while not having too many enemies because many people would oppose him and not support him otherwise. So he'll probably potentially never be president. And in America, if you're not supported by AIPAC, one way or another, I don't think you'll ever be president anyway. AIPAC is just one of those things where, come on, Israel, we know it runs America. Let's just be honest with ourselves, guys. That's what's actually going on. And the whole Gaza thing, that's a whole different story. We'll talk about that another time. But this all would be very difficult. We're asking a mountain of things. And, we tend to, when you think of people like this, they tend to kind of be in the city council level, or they may be, someone unknown, but they work in the government. They work to try to actually help at the local level. But for them to go from the local level to big time politics is very, very difficult. That's just not something that you wake up and do every day. It's just not something easy. So there's a reason why it's really hard for people to make it to the national level, or Congress or something like that and not be known. It's very difficult. Or even potentially become president. There's always a bigger interest that's above you. There's always someone that wants to control your idea. There's always someone who's interested to saying, hey, this person has this reach. Maybe we can get something done. They're going to use you. Look, man, money talks, I guess, is my ultimate point or ultimate perspective on that end. But they even tried to mention in the podcast that, hey, why don't we create an amendment to get rid of bribery or donating money for special interests in the government? They actually did that in, I believe, the 40s, but it didn't last long. It just didn't last long. It would be very difficult to do something like that today. And many would not vote for something like this to pass today anyway, because trust me, they want the money. Like, let's just be honest. It takes a special person to be thrown $200 million and say no to it. That takes a special person, if I'm being completely honest. Even recently, when Trump was thrown $230 million to, cover for Israel, he did. Even he couldn't say no. And technically, he's a billionaire, right? Look, I don't know. But it's a brilliant idea. But there's reasons why this stuff kind of keeps going on this way to this day. And there's also a great way of keeping it very quiet at this point as well, because a lot of people think the U.S. government has no corruption in it. The only difference is that U.S. government corruption is not the same as other countries, and you got to actually go digging for it. But there's a lot of corruption going on in the U.S. government. But what kind of candidate? What would a candidate look like? That would be crazy enough to be this person. This would be something very different. I've been scratching my head and trying to think about it, but I can't come up with an answer. You have to also think that it has to be someone maybe who's a billionaire, maybe a centibillionaire, has to be worth over 100 billion, so that he doesn't have to worry about donations and stuff like that. Maybe he can fund a campaign. He would have to be a centibillionaire that's not well known to the public. I don't know if there are any of those in the US. I think they're all pretty much well known. Um, hmm. Look, I don't know. I don't know. I've been trying to think about this ever since I heard that podcast, but I just don't think that this is possible. Whereas the majority have a bigger voices, the majority will have bigger voices. Meaning, majority, when I say that, I mean the people will have the voices, and however, we have the voices, but we also have the least power because there's also the least amount of money in that situation. So when something goes wrong, who's going to be the one that backs you in this kind of situation? Usually they're going to lean towards the people who have the power. So even when it comes to social issues, they're not going to focus on social issues that takes care of the 5% of the country. That's just a fact. I mean, I can't even give a simple example with this. Those are more local things that a lot of people in the country don't even get to know about. But think about it like when Michelle Obama did her whole thing about food deserts. Listen, food deserts are extremely important. People should be able to have access to clean water, healthy foods, and not just fast foods that's making them very unhealthy and on and on. Food deserts are a problem, but outside of Michelle Obama pushing that so hard while Barack was in office, how often do you hear about food deserts outside of mini documentaries? You know, some comedians actually have used it as a talking point, but that goes in one ear and not the other ear after people are laughing. You know, I completely support this idea. It's a great movement. People should have access to clean food and healthy food, you know? But the problem doesn't affect the majority, so it doesn't get the attention that it actually deserves. So, with all honesty, it's quite sad that some of these things kind of go by the wayside. Or even let's think about Flint, Michigan. You know, when they had their whole water crisis and then Coca-Cola came in buying up all the water for nothing, for $200 a year or something like that. And the people were actually the ones suffering, the citizens of the city. But after a few days on the news, and then, you know, after a couple things on social media showing how bad it was, people kind of just went back on to their everyday life. It wasn't that big of a story again. You know, even I think Dr. Phil mentioned it and some other, you know, YouTubers and stuff like that. But outside of influencers and stuff like that pushing it, it kind of became an afterthought after a while. I don't even know if most people remember the Flint, Michigan water issue going on right now. So that's kind of what I mean by the focus will stick to what affects the majority and not the minority. But I think that's going to be the biggest challenge for someone to come out and just be like, hey, I'm going to go against the grain. I'm not going to accept any money or bribery or anything like that. And I'm going to win the presidency. Can you think of someone who this might be? Because I can't.